The first bale of hay hit Karen Whitfield's pristine white BMW with a satisfying thump at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would go down in Millbrook County folklore. That moment of sweet revenge was still 3 weeks away when Tom Henderson first discovered his neighbor had turned his daily routine into a battlefield. Tom had been running Henderson family farm for 23 years, ever since his father passed and left him the sprawling 400-acre property that bordered the county's most exclusive subdivision, Willowbrook Estates. The irony wasn't lost on him that his great-grandfather had sold that very land to developers in the 1980s, back when nobody could have imagined that million-dollar McMansions would sprout up like weeds next to working farmland. For 2 decades, the arrangement had been peaceful. The subdivision residents enjoyed their pastoral views, while Tom went about his business of raising cattle and growing hay. Sure, there were occasional complaints about the rooster crowing at dawn or the smell of manure after fertilizing, but nothing that couldn't be smoothed over with a neighborly conversation and maybe a basket of fresh eggs. Then Karen Whitfield moved in. She arrived on a Saturday in March, directing a parade of moving trucks with the precision of a military general and the temperament of a hurricane. Tom watched from his kitchen window as she barked orders at the movers, her blonde hair whipping in the wind as she gestured dramatically at boxes and furniture. Her husband, a meek-looking man in expensive polo shirts, trailed behind her like a lost puppy, nodding at everything she said. The trouble started the very next Monday. Tom was heading out to check his cattle at sunrise when he found Karen standing in his driveway, arms crossed, wearing a pink velour tracksuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her arm as she blocked his path to the hay shed. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the particular brand of authority that came from years of getting her way through sheer persistence. "We need to talk." Tom shut off his truck and climbed out, his work boots crunching on the gravel. At 62, he was still built like the college football player he'd once been, though his brown hair had gone silver at the temples. He'd dealt with difficult people before, city folks who thought farming was just a quaint hobby, bureaucrats who'd never seen a cow up close, but something about Karen's stance told him this was going to be different. "Morning, Mrs. Whitfield," he said politely, tipping his worn baseball cap. "What can I do for you?" "It's about your activities," she began, waving her hand dismissively toward his farm. "The noise, the smells, the constant traffic. Do you have any idea what this is doing to our property values?" Tom blinked. "Ma'am, this has been a working farm since 1952. Your development was built around us." "That may be," Karen replied, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document, "but I've done my research. There are noise ordinances, environmental regulations, and property maintenance standards that I'm quite certain you're violating." She held up the phone, showing him a screenshot of county zoning laws. "For instance, did you know that agricultural operations within 500 feet of residential areas are subject to specific restrictions regarding early morning activities?" Tom felt his jaw tighten. He'd been getting up at 5 a.m. to tend to his animals for over 2 decades. His cattle needed feeding, and his schedule had never bothered anyone before. "Mrs. Whitfield, I appreciate your concerns, but—" "I'm not finished," she interrupted, swiping to another screen. "There's also the matter of your hay shed blocking our view of the sunset. My husband and I paid a premium for this lot specifically because of the western exposure and your structure. It's creating an unsightly obstruction." Tom turned to look at the hay shed in question. It was a simple metal building, maybe 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, positioned exactly where his father had built it in 1978. It stored equipment, hay bales, and seasonal supplies. Nothing fancy, but functional and well-maintained. The fact that it was barely visible from Karen's property made her complaint even more ridiculous. "That shed's been there for 45 years, Tom said carefully. "Well, times change," Karen replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps you could relocate it? Or maybe consider alternative arrangements for your farming activities." The way she said alternative arrangements made it clear she meant stopping altogether. Tom looked at this woman who'd lived in his neighborhood for exactly 3 days and was already trying to reshape everything around her convenience. He thought about his father, who'd worked this land through droughts and floods, good years and bad. He thought about the generations of Henderson family sweat that had soaked into this soil. "I'll take your concerns under consideration," he said finally, which was his polite way of saying absolutely not. Karen's expression hardened. "I certainly hope so, Mr. Henderson, because if we can't resolve this amicably, I'll have to explore other options." As she clicked away on her designer heels, her threat hanging in the morning air like storm clouds, Tom had no idea that his neighbor was about to turn his peaceful farming life into a war zone. He also couldn't have imagined that 3 weeks later he'd be standing in that same spot, watching Karen's precious BMW disappear under an avalanche of hay bales, while half the county cheered him on. But every great battle starts with a single shot fired, and Karen Whitfield had just pulled the trigger. Tom Henderson spent that Monday afternoon doing something he hadn't done in 23 years of farming. He called in sick. Not because he was unwell, but because he needed time to think, and thinking required the kind of quiet that only came when Karen Whitfield wasn't performing her morning theater outside his window. He sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee and his father's old leather notebook, the one filled with decades of farming wisdom, weather observations, and the occasional philosophical musings of a man who understood that patience was a farmer's greatest tool. His father had written on the last page, "Sometimes the best fertilizer is letting things rot naturally before you plant something new." Tom smiled at that entry. His father had been talking about composting, but the advice seemed to apply to his current situation perfectly. The coffee was still warm when his phone rang. Sheriff Mike Calloway's name appeared on the screen. They'd gone to high school together and had remained friends through the decades. "Tom, I got a call about some kind of dispute with your neighbor," Mike said without preamble. "Something about blocked access and property violations." "Karen Whitfield filed a complaint," Tom confirmed. "She's got traffic cones blocking my hay shed, claims it's too close to the property line." There was a pause. "Tom, that shed's been there since we were kids. I remember helping your dad pour the foundation when I was about 16. That's what I told her. "Well, legally speaking, she can't just block access to your property with traffic cones. That's not how zoning disputes work." But Mike's voice carried the tone of someone delivering bad news. "She's not technically wrong about the 15-foot setback rule. It's an old regulation that's rarely enforced. But if someone makes a formal complaint, they have to investigate," Tom finished. "Exactly. Look, I can make her move the cones today, but the zoning complaint is going to take weeks to resolve. And between you and me, she's been calling the county office twice a day since Friday. They're getting tired of hearing from her, but they have to follow procedure." After hanging up, Tom walked out to survey his property with new eyes. Karen thought she was playing chess, moving pieces around the board to control his movements. What she didn't realize was that she was playing chess while Tom was about to switch to a completely different game. He started with reconnaissance. Over the next 3 days, Tom observed Karen's routine with the methodical attention he usually reserved for weather patterns. She left her house at exactly 8:15 a.m. in her white BMW, returned at 5:30 p.m., and parked in the same spot every single time, the circular driveway right in front of her house, positioned to show off the car like a showroom display. The BMW was clearly Karen's pride and joy. Tom had watched her wash and wax it every Saturday morning, using more towels and products than most people use in a month. She even yelled at the mail carrier for getting too close to it with his truck. On Wednesday evening, Tom drove his pickup to Miller's Feed and Supply, where he had a conversation with Eddie Miller that would have sounded perfectly normal to anyone listening. Just two farmers discussing the upcoming hay season. "I'm going to need a lot more hay than usual this year," Tom told Eddie, thinking about increasing the herd, maybe diversifying operations. "How much more are we talking?" Eddie asked, leaning against the counter. "Oh, maybe 40, 50 extra bales to start. The good stuff, nice and loose, not too tightly bound. I don't want it to spread easy when I'm working with it." Eddie nodded. "I can get you premium loose pack from Johnson's farm. Light, fluffy, spreads like butter. When do you need it?" "Let's say Friday delivery." And Eddie. Tom paused at the door. "Make sure it's the kind that sticks to everything. You know how some hay just clings to whatever it touches?" "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," Eddie grinned. "Johnson's hay is famous for that. It's into every crack and crevice." Thursday brought the zoning inspector, a tired-looking man named Harold Potts, who measured Tom's shed with the enthusiasm of someone filling out tax forms. Karen hovered nearby with her phone, documenting every moment while Harold did his job. "Well," Harold announced after 20 minutes of measuring and note-taking, "the structure is indeed within the 15-foot setback zone. However, it predates the regulation by several decades, which typically grandfathers it in. I'll need to research the exact date the setback rule went into effect." Karen's face fell. "But surely there must be something." "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but the law is the law. If this shed was here before the regulation, then it's likely protected. I should have a ruling within 2 weeks." As Harold packed up his equipment, Tom caught Karen's expression, a mixture of frustration and determination that told him she wasn't giving up. She'd find another angle, another regulation, another way to make his life difficult. That evening, Tom made 2 more phone calls. The first was to his nephew Danny, who ran a small landscaping business and owed Tom a favor from the previous summer when Tom had helped him move equipment after Danny's truck broke down. "Uncle Tom, you need what?" Danny laughed into the phone. "Just a few hours of your time Friday morning and maybe borrow that big leaf blower of yours. The industrial one. This wouldn't have anything to do with your neighbor's situation, would it?" Tom smiled. "Let's just say I'm planning some creative landscaping." The second call was to Martha Henley at the Millbrook County Gazette. Martha had been covering local news for 30 years and had a nose for stories that would get people talking. Martha, hypothetically speaking, if someone were to create a visually interesting situation involving farm equipment and suburban property disputes, would that be the kind of thing you might want to photograph? Tom Henderson, are you planning something that's going to make me laugh or get you arrested? Hopefully just the first one. Well then, hypothetically speaking, I might be driving around the county Friday morning with my camera just in case anything newsworthy happens to occur. Tom hung up and walked out to his back pasture, where his cattle were settling in for the night. The stars were coming out, and the air carried the familiar sense of grass and earth that had been his world for over 6 decades. Tomorrow, Karen Whitfield was going to learn that when you declare war on a farmer, you better be prepared for the kind of creative problem-solving that. Friday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that farmers dream about. Calm winds, clear skies, and just enough humidity to make loose hay stick to absolutely everything it touched. Tom was awake at 4:30 a.m., not because of his usual routine, but because today required precise timing. At 6:15 a.m., Eddie Miller's delivery truck rumbled up Tom's driveway, loaded with 50 bales of the fluffiest, most adhesive hay Johnson's farm had ever produced. Tom directed Eddie to unload everything in his back pasture well out of sight of the Willowbrook subdivision. "You sure you know what you're doing, Tom?" Eddie asked as they stacked the final bales. "Eddie, I've been farming for 43 years. I think I can handle distributing some hay," Tom replied with a grin that made Eddie shake his head and drive away quickly, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. At 7:45 a.m., Danny arrived with his landscaping truck and the industrial leaf blower, a machine powerful enough to clear leaves from a football field in minutes. Tom had used similar equipment for clearing grain chaff, but never for the creative purpose he had in mind today. "Okay, Uncle Tom, I'm here, but I still don't understand what we're doing," Danny said, eyeing the mountain of hay bales suspiciously. Tom checked his watch, 8:10 a.m. Karen would be leaving for work in exactly 5 minutes, which meant her precious BMW would be sitting unattended in her circular driveway in precisely 6 minutes. "Danny, how would you like to help your old uncle make some minor adjustments to the local landscape?" Tom asked, already breaking open the first hay bale. At 8:16 a.m., Karen's BMW pulled out of her driveway and disappeared down Sunset Drive, right on schedule. Tom watched from behind his hay shed, the same shed Karen had tried to block with traffic cones just 4 days earlier. "Showtime," he announced. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook County for years to come. Tom and Danny loaded the loose hay into Danny's pickup truck in careful layers, creating what Tom privately called Operation Haystack. They drove to the property line separating Tom's farm from the Willowbrook subdivision, where Tom had spent Thursday evening removing a section of his own fence, technically his right as a property owner and perfectly legal. The gap provided clear access to Karen's circular driveway. Danny positioned his truck at the property line while Tom set up the industrial leaf blower at the perfect angle. The machine roared to life with a sound like a jet engine, and Tom began feeding loose hay into its intake. The result was magnificent. 43 years of understanding wind patterns, air currents, and the physics of agricultural materials came together in one perfect moment of rural artistry. The hay shot out of the blower in a golden arc, riding the morning air currents with the precision of a guided missile system. The first load landed on Karen's BMW like a gentle snowfall, covering the hood and windshield in a thick layer of Johnson's finest loose pack hay. The second load added bulk to the roof and trunk. By the third load, the car was beginning to look less like a vehicle and more like a small, white-cord haystack. Tom had calculated everything perfectly. The hay was dry enough to stick, but not wet enough to damage the paint. The blower had enough power to distribute it evenly, but not so much that it would scratch the car's surface. Even the timing was perfect, enough time before Karen returned from work for the hay to settle naturally, creating the most authentic-looking haystack Millbrook County had ever seen in a suburban driveway. Danny stood watching in amazement as his uncle transformed a luxury vehicle into agricultural art. "Uncle Tom, this is either the most brilliant thing I've ever seen or the most insane." "Sometimes there's no difference," Tom replied, loading another armful of hay into the blower. By 9:30 a.m., Karen's BMW had completely disappeared under what appeared to be a regulation-size haystack, complete with a natural settling and shaping that only came from proper agricultural technique. Tom added a few artistic touches around the base, making it look like the haystack had been there for weeks. Martha Henley arrived just as Tom was putting the finishing touches on his masterpiece. She parked her car at the edge of the subdivision and walked over with her camera, shaking her head in disbelief. "Tom Henderson, in 30 years of reporting, I have never seen anything like this," she said, snapping photos from multiple angles. This is either the most creative protest in county history or the most elaborate practical joke ever pulled. I prefer to think of it as performance art, Tom replied, admiring his work. A commentary on the relationship between rural and suburban communities. Martha laughed so hard she nearly dropped her camera. Oh, this is going on the front page. What should I call it? Tom considered the question seriously. How about local farmer finds creative solution to neighbor dispute? At 5:28 p.m., Tom was sitting on his front porch when Karen's car, her other car, a silver SUV, came racing down Sunset Drive. He heard the screech of brakes followed by a silence that seemed to stretch across the entire county. Then came the scream. Henderson. Tom Henderson. Karen's voice carried across the property line with the force of a tornado siren. Tom could see her standing in her driveway, hands on her hips, staring at what had once been her pristine white BMW and was now a perfect example of traditional hay storage. Tom stood up slowly, walked to his property line, and called back, "Evening, Mrs. Whitfield. How was your day?" "My sar." "What did you do to my sar?" "Your car." Tom looked genuinely puzzled, glancing at the haystack in her driveway. "I don't see a car. I see a haystack on your property, which, according to your own arguments about property rights, should be your responsibility to maintain." Karen sputtered, her face turning various shades of red that would have made a sunset jealous. You can't. This is vandalism." "Ma'am, I haven't touched your property," Tom replied calmly. "I've been conducting perfectly legal agricultural activities on my own land. If some hay happened to blow onto your driveway due to natural wind patterns, well, that's just one of those things that happens when you choose to live next to a working farm." The beauty of Tom's revenge was in its simplicity. He hadn't actually touched Karen's car or set foot on her property. He'd simply used the wind, physics, and 43 years of farming expertise to relocate some of his hay. The fact that it had landed in the exact shape of a haystack on top of her BMW was, technically speaking, just a remarkable coincidence. Karen stood there for a full minute, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, trying to find words for a situation that had no precedent in her experience of suburban warfare. Finally, she managed to speak. "This isn't over, Henderson." Tom tipped his hat politely. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose it is, but I'd say we're even now. You blocked my hay shed. So I found an alternative storage location for my hay. Seems fair to me." As Karen stomped toward her house, probably to call every lawyer in the phone book, Tom allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best solutions came from thinking like a farmer. Work with what you have, understand your environment, and remember that patience and creativity could overcome almost any obstacle. The war wasn't over, but Tom Henderson had just won the most important battle, and half of Millbrook County was going to read about it in tomorrow's newspaper. Saturday morning's edition of the Millbrook County Gazette sold out by 10 a.m. for the first time in Martha Henley's 30-year career. The front page photo showed Karen's BMW transformed into a perfect haystack, with the headline, "Local Farmers' Creative Solution Goes Viral," in bold letters that could be read from 3 blocks away. By noon, the story had been shared on social media over 2,000 times, with comments ranging from absolute legend to "This is the most brilliant thing I've ever seen." Someone had created a hashtag Haystack Revenge, and tourists were actually driving to Willowbrook Estates to take selfies with what local news stations were calling the Great Haystack of Sunset Drive. Tom discovered this when Sheriff Mike Calloway knocked on his door at 1 p.m., trying his best to look official while clearly fighting back laughter. "Tom, I'm about to ask," Mike said, consulting his notepad with exaggerated seriousness. "Did you or did you not use agricultural equipment to deposit hay on your neighbor's vehicle?" "Mike, I use agricultural equipment to conduct agricultural activities on my own property," Tom replied. "If some of my hay happened to be redistributed by natural wind currents, well, that's just the unpredictable nature of farming." Mike nodded solemnly, making notes. "And would you say these agricultural activities were conducted in response to your neighbor's complaints about your farming operations?" "I'd say they were conducted in response to my need to find alternative storage solutions when my usual hay shed was declared off limits pending a zoning investigation." "Ah," Mike closed his notepad. "Well, technically speaking, you didn't commit any crimes. Creatively speaking, you're either the most patient man in the county or the most devious." He paused, probably both. The real resolution came on Sunday afternoon when Tom noticed unusual activity at Karen's house. A procession of vehicles had been arriving all day. Luxury SUVs, expensive sedans, and what appeared to be a catering truck. Through his kitchen window, Tom could see people gathering in Karen's backyard, and he recognized several faces from the Quality of Life Committee. At 4 p.m., Karen herself appeared at Tom's front door. But this wasn't the imperious tracksuit-wearing Karen who'd been terrorizing him for weeks. This woman looked tired, deflated, and, if Tom wasn't mistaken, slightly embarrassed. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "We need to talk." Tom invited her to sit on his front porch, the same spot where he'd been planning his haystack strategy just days earlier. Karen perched on the edge of a chair as if ready to flee at any moment. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for her to speak. "The whole situation got out of hand." Tom waited, understanding that sometimes the best response was simply to listen. "My husband's family is visiting this weekend," Karen continued, gesturing toward her house. "His mother, his siblings, their kids. They all saw the newspaper article. They'd all saw the photos." She paused, looking genuinely pained. "They think it's hilarious. And you don't." Tom asked gently. Karen was quiet for a long moment. 20 years ago, I would have," she admitted. "Before I became this person who complains about everything and tries to control everything around me." She looked at Tom directly for the first time since sitting down. "When did I become someone who calls a family farm a hobby?" It was a question that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Tom. "Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start," she continued. "New house, new neighborhood, new life. But instead of embracing what was already here, I tried to change everything to match some perfect picture I had in my head." She gestured toward the hay shed that had started their entire conflict. "That shed isn't blocking our sunset view. It's barely visible from our house. I was just looking for things to be wrong because being angry felt easier than being grateful." Tom studied this woman who had transformed from his nemesis into someone who seemed genuinely reflective. "What changed your mind?" Karen smiled ruefully. "This morning, my 6-year-old nephew asked me why I was so mean to the nice farmer man who made the funny car Haystack. When I tried to explain about property values and noise ordinances, he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language." She shook her head. "Out of the mouths of babes, right? Kids have a way of cutting through the nonsense," Tom agreed. "The thing is," Karen said, "everyone loves what you did. Not just because it was clever, though it was incredibly clever, but because it was proportional. I tried to shut down your family business over a property line dispute, and you turned my car into yard art for a weekend. You made your point without actually hurting anything." Tom hadn't thought of it in those terms, but she was right. The hay hadn't damaged her car. Eddie Miller had helped him remove it Saturday evening, and the BMW was spotless underneath. It had been the perfect combination of dramatic and harmless. "So where do we go from here?" Tom asked. Karen took a deep breath. "I'm withdrawing the zoning complaint. I've already called Harold Potts and told him the issue is resolved. I'm also disbanding the Quality of Life Committee. Turns out most of the members joined because they were afraid to say no to me, not because they actually had problems with your farm." She stood up, smoothing down her clothes, regular clothes, Tom noticed, not a tracksuit in sight. "I'd also like to buy eggs from you again, if you're willing to sell them. My nephew tried one of your eggs at breakfast this morning and declared it the best egg in the universe." Tom smiled. "I think we can arrange that." As Karen walked back toward her house, where her family was probably waiting to hear how the great reconciliation had gone, Tom reflected on the strange turns life could take. A week ago, he'd been at war with his neighbor. Today, that same neighbor had apologized, complimented his strategy, and asked to buy his eggs. The hay shed stood exactly where it had always stood, casting the same shadows it had cast for 45 years. The only difference was that now it had a story attached to it. The story of the day a farmer's patience ran out and his creativity took over. Monday morning brought a return to normal routines. Tom was up at 5 a.m., tending to his cattle and checking his equipment. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Karen's white BMW, now spotless and hay-free, pulled out of her driveway. But this time, when she saw Tom in his yard, she waved. Tom waved back. The Millbrook County Gazette ran a follow-up story the next week. Neighbors find common ground after Haystack incident. It wasn't nearly as popular as the original article, but Martha Henley thought it was a better story. One about how conflict could lead to understanding if people were willing to step back from their positions and remember their humanity. Tom kept a copy of both articles in his father's old leather notebook, right next to the entry about letting things rot naturally before planting something new. Sometimes he thought the best fertilizer for a relationship was a good dose of creative problem-solving and the willingness to admit when you've been wrong. The hay shed still stood at the edge of his property, storing equipment and supplies just as it always had. But now it also stored something else. The memory of the day Tom Henderson proved that a farmer's ingenuity could triumph over suburban entitlement, and that sometimes the best way to end a war was with a perfectly placed haystack and a good sense of humor. Karen never again complained about the rooster crowing at dawn. In fact, she started setting her alarm for 6 a.m. so she could enjoy her coffee on the back deck while listening to what she now called the authentic sounds of rural morning. Her nephew, during subsequent visits, would ask Tom to show him how the leaf blower worked, though Tom always diplomatically suggested they stick to more traditional farming demonstrations. The white BMW never again became a haystack, but every time Tom saw it in Karen's driveway, he smiled. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions came not from anger or legal threats, but from patience, creativity, and the kind of practical wisdom that only came from a lifetime of working the land. And if anyone in Millbrook County ever doubted that farmers were the most resourceful people on earth, they only had to drive by Sunset Drive and remember the day Tom Henderson turned a property dispute into agricultural art, one perfectly placed bale of hay at a time.